I've got some troubling news about England's royal family.
So here is something that should not be possible inside Buckingham Palace. We are not talking about simple family gossip anymore. We are not talking about minor disagreements over royal protocol or who sits where at dinner. We are talking about a quiet, calculated rebellion that almost brought state planning to a sudden halt. Camilla is the queen. She wears the heavy crown, rides in the golden carriages, and sits beside the king at every state occasion. Yet a woman who will never be queen, who holds no place in the line of succession, and who had nothing personal to gain, stood in a quiet corridor, listened to Camilla beg for one small favor, and looked her in the eye and said no. Princess Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. The corridor on the first floor was completely clear of press pools, cameras, and official staff. 3 names were on the movement sheet that morning: Anne, Catherine, and one senior private secretary, carrying nothing at all. Camilla was not on that movement sheet. She came anyway. She reached them with about 20 feet of corridor to spare, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor before hitting the carpet. She asked for a delay, not a cancellation, and that small detail is worth holding on to, because it tells you she already knew she had lost the larger fight. Camilla said the timing was completely wrong. She claimed the country was watching the king's ongoing health struggles, counting the days between his official engagements, and that walking the Princess of Wales into that room in that particular week would look disastrous. She said it would not look like preparation to the public. She said it would look like replacement. Camilla used that exact word, replacement, and standing right there beside them, the future queen said absolutely nothing at all. Think for a moment about where Catherine actually was. She was trapped between a woman begging for her public humiliation to be postponed and a woman about to make it permanent. Catherine had no folder in her hands. She had no notes, no legal title giving her the right to be in that hallway, and every extra second turned her into the center of a fight she had never once asked to lead. But Anne did not soften by a fraction. Anne told the Queen Consort that this decision no longer belonged to her pride, her fear, or her private household. A confidential royal council, a small group of senior family members, and top advisors who quietly prepare the monarchy for the choices nobody wants to announce, had already approved the entire briefing. Catherine was going through those doors because the immense duties she will soon carry beside William require her to hold information that used to stop exclusively at the king. And then Anne said the single sentence that ended the conversation on the spot. Charles had signed the instruction himself. That single fact changed everything standing in that cold corridor. The king's own order gave Catherine immediate, unhindered access to the emergency planning that keeps the crown functioning during severe illness, during sudden political crisis, or during any moment when the sovereign physically cannot perform the job. Camilla heard the words, but the thing that actually wounded her was not the access itself. It was the sudden discovery that her husband had made that decision without giving her any opportunity to stop it. Catherine finally looked toward Anne, and Anne answered her with one small, certain gesture. In her left hand rested the heavy crimson folder. It was household stationery, the specific kind used for private declarations that never go near a press office. Inside that folder lay a formal written order setting out the whole new legal arrangement for the Princess of Wales. And clipped separately behind everything else, sitting folded once at the back of the file, was one single page that Camilla had never been shown. Camilla looked down at the crimson leather, her eyes fixing on that hidden document. She asked Anne what was written on that last page. Anne did not answer her. The corridor went completely quiet. 2 private secretaries at the far end of the hallway immediately looked down and started studying the pattern on the carpet, just to avoid making eye contact. In those few lingering seconds, standing there with no answer coming, Camilla finally understood the terrifying truth that had been building for weeks without her knowledge. This was not a sudden act of support from Anne. This was enforcement. Someone had built the legal case, gathered the paperwork, secured the king's signature, and chosen Anne to walk it through to the end. Camilla had not lost an argument in a hallway. She had lost a silent campaign she never knew was running. But before we reveal what was written on that hidden page that left the Queen Consort standing in silence, I need to ask you something directly. Hi viewers, if you were in Catherine's position standing in that corridor, would you have remained silent, or would you have spoken up to defend Camilla? Type silent in the comments if you agree with Catherine's choice, or type defend if you think Camilla deserved a voice. If you truly care about standing up for royal truth and accountability, hit that like button and subscribe right now, because walking away without subscribing means you are letting the palace sweep these critical stories under the rug forever. What Anne did in the next 30 seconds was on the front page of every major newspaper in Britain by the following morning. A national broadcaster opened its evening bulletin with it. A crowd gathered outside the palace gates demanding answers. When you see what actually happened in that hallway, you will understand why the entire country reacted the way it did, because it takes about 4 seconds to look at, and it says everything. I spend my time going through everything that moves around this family. I examine the public filings, the official records, and the stories that got buried before anyone finished asking the right questions. What you are hearing right now is me putting those pieces together exactly as I read them. Stay with me until the end of this story, because that last page is where this whole crisis lands. To understand why Anne chose Catherine over Camilla, without a single moment of hesitation, you have to understand what all three of these women were actually carrying on that ordinary weekday morning. Behind the glittering titles, the historic ceremonies, and the carefully crafted palace statements, three powerful women were staring at three completely different futures. Camilla feared being pushed to the edge. Catherine feared becoming the symbol of another woman's defeat, and Anne was facing the hardest choice of all. To understand how this crisis escalated to that palace hallway, we have to go back 3 weeks earlier. The Abbey was freezing that afternoon. High up in the vaulted stone arches of Westminster Abbey, cold spring light filtered through stained glass windows, casting long blue shadows across the empty aisle where kings and queens are crowned. Nobody from the press was allowed inside. This was supposed to be a quiet walk-through for the upcoming Commonwealth Day service, a routine rehearsal to make sure everyone knew their exact positions. Then Catherine walked down the nave. She moved toward her assigned choir stall near the altar. She stopped. Why was her placement card sitting 4 feet behind its usual position? Silence. Someone had moved it. In the official protocol documents printed that very morning, the Princess of Wales was designated to walk directly alongside the sovereign's immediate household. But the physical card sitting on the red velvet cushion told a completely different story. It placed Catherine 3 paces behind Queen Camilla, in a position reserved for secondary family members, and clipped to the corner of that card was a handwritten note stating that Catherine's private continuity briefing, scheduled for immediately after the service rehearsal, had been indefinitely postponed. Think about what that moment felt like for her. You are standing in an empty, freezing cathedral. You are holding physical evidence of a deliberate public attempt to push you into the background. You know the cameras will be filling those balconies in less than 48 hours. Do you make a scene? Do you demand to know who touched your seat? Catherine did none of those things. She picked up the card. Her fingers did not shake. She folded the thick white cardstock once, then twice, creating a tight paper rectangle that hid the printed name entirely. She slipped it into her handbag, zipped it shut, and kept walking as if nothing had happened at all. She completed the rehearsal with absolute composure, stepping precisely where she was told to step, bowing her head at the correct altars, and smiling at the Abbey staff. If you are ignoring the subtle signs of disrespect in your own life just to keep the peace, you are doing exactly what Catherine tried to do that day. But ask yourself how long anyone can carry that weight before it breaks them. If you refuse to let people push you into the shadows, hit the subscribe button right now to show your support for Catherine, because scrolling past without subscribing tells me you think people should just stay quiet when they are being mistreated. Catherine thought her dignity would settle the issue. She was wrong, because standing in the shadows near the St. George Chapel screen, watching every single second of that exchange, was Princess Anne. Anne knows how palace staff work. She knows that when orders change without warning, It is almost never a mistake made by junior aides. Junior aides follow lists. They follow instructions down to the millimeter. A mistake of 4 feet in an Abbey seating chart does not happen by accident. It happens by intent. Anne did not send an email. She did not send a text message. Digital records can be leaked, intercepted, or quietly deleted by household administrators with system privileges. Instead, Anne walked straight out of the Abbey, drove to her private quarters, and opened a plain black leather-bound journal. She pulled out a fountain pen, filled with sharp red ink, and she started writing. I have examined how Anne operates when she senses institutional danger. She becomes an investigator. Page by page, she began logging every odd occurrence from the past 6 months. A delayed car in March, a missing briefing packet in April, a sudden last-minute schedule shift that left Catherine arriving at an event after the Queen Consort had already entered the room. Taken alone, each incident looked like minor administrative friction. Written down in red ink on white paper, they formed a clear pattern of systematic exclusion. 2 days after the Abbey rehearsal, Anne summoned the senior Abbey coordinator to a private side office. She closed the heavy oak door. She did not sit down. She held up the folded seating plan and asked one question. Who gave the order to adjust the Princess of Wales's walking position? The coordinator hesitated. His face went pale. He shifted his weight from foot to foot, looking everywhere except at Anne's eyes. He admitted that the change had come through a verbal directive delivered by a private secretary attached to Queen Camilla's household. Anne asked if the King's private secretary had signed off on the instruction. The coordinator admitted that the King's office had never been notified. The order had completely bypassed the sovereign's desk. Anne thanked the man, told him to return to his duties, and turned back to her leather logbook. She drew a dark red line under the entry. But the real shock came when she reviewed the written reason given for cancelling Catherine's continuity briefing. The administrative note claimed the cancellation was required due to an ongoing private legal review regarding royal protocol update procedures. Anne immediately contacted the senior legal advisors to the Crown. She asked for the case file on this protocol review. The chief legal counsel replied within an hour. There was no legal review. No lawyer had been retained. No document had been drafted. The entire legal issue had been completely fabricated out of thin air, simply to block Catherine from stepping into that briefing room. Anne looked at the red ink on the page. The realization hit her with devastating clarity. This was not about seating arrangements or cathedral rehearsals anymore. This was a direct, unauthorized intervention designed to keep the future Queen Consort locked out of state intelligence. Anne closed the journal. She picked up her telephone and dialed a secure private line. She did not call the King's secretary. She called Prince William. What William did when he saw that red ink logbook changed the balance of power inside Buckingham Palace forever. He did not wait for a formal meeting. He drove straight to Clarence House with a 30-year-old photograph in his hands and forced a confrontation with King Charles that left the sovereign staring at his desk in utter silence. If you think you know how far Prince William was willing to go to protect Catherine, you are completely unprepared for the private document he forced his father to sign that very night. Do not close this video or walk away now, because in the next chapter, we are exposing the exact words written in that signed mandate, including the hidden clause that stripped Camilla's office of its administrative authority in one single stroke. When Prince William picked up that secure line from Princess Anne, he did not just listen. He took action immediately. I have spent years tracking how William operates when threat levels rise inside the royal household, and he does not waste words. Anne laid out the physical facts: the altered seating card in Westminster Abbey, the cancelled briefing, the fake legal memo from Queen Camilla's private secretary. William went straight to his desk. He opened his personal access logs. He demanded an immediate cross-reference of every administrative hold request submitted across the entire royal estate over the previous 6 months. The digital ledger showed complete silence from the High Court lawyers. No legal team had ever been retained to examine protocol changes. The memo sitting on Catherine's desk was an absolute fiction. It was a manufactured roadblock designed to buy time until Catherine's public schedule became too crowded to fit the continuity training in. William realized what was happening. His wife was being intentionally kept in the dark about vital state operations, while the king managed his ongoing health challenges. Why would anyone want the future queen to remain unprepared during a national crisis? Fear. Plain and simple. If Catherine entered that room, if she received the royal seals and the high-level intelligence briefs, the transition of power would no longer be a distant theoretical concept. It would become an active reality, sitting right at the table. William walked over to a small wooden cabinet in his private study. Inside lay an old leather binder containing personal photographs that never see the light of day. He pulled out one single picture from September 1997. It was an image of a 15-year-old boy standing in a dark woolen suit, staring down at the cobblestones as he walked behind a flag-draped coffin through the streets of London. I want you to think about that boy for a second. He was terrified. He was completely unprepared for the global eyes watching his every move. He had been thrown into the harsh spotlight of history, without a shield, without guidance, and without the institution protecting his emotional survival. William swore a silent oath that day. He promised himself that if he ever brought a woman into this family, he would never, ever allow the system to leave her isolated or vulnerable. He picked up that 1997 photograph. He placed it inside his suit pocket. Then he picked up Anne's red ink logbook and drove directly to Clarence House. Look at your own life for a single second. Have you ever stood up and fought for someone you loved when everyone else in the room was telling you to stay quiet and avoid making a scene? If you have the courage to defend your family no matter how uncomfortable it gets, hit the subscribe button right now to join us. If you walk away right now without subscribing, you are telling me that you would just sit back and let the people you care about get pushed around without lifting a finger. William arrived at Clarence House without an appointment. He walked past the junior staff in the hallway, opened the heavy oak doors to King Charles's private study, and walked right inside. Princess Anne was already sitting across from the king's desk. The room was quiet. The soft sound of rain tapped against the high glass windows overlooking the private gardens. King Charles sat behind his broad mahogany desk, surrounded by official red dispatch boxes and stacks of state paperwork. He looked exhausted. The physical toll of his ongoing medical treatments was obvious in the slow way he turned his head toward the door. William did not sit down. He walked straight up to the king's desk. He pulled the 1997 photograph from his jacket pocket and placed it face up on top of the red state papers. Right beside it, he laid out the red ink logbook from Anne, open to the page showing the fabricated legal review. Charles looked down at the photograph of his young son walking behind Princess Diana's coffin. Then he looked at the written evidence of Camilla's interference. The king sighed heavily. He picked up a fountain pen and tapped it against the desk. He was a man caught in a terrible emotional trap. On one side stood his wife, a woman he had spent decades protecting from public hostility, now terrified of being sidelined as his health faltered. On the other side stood his heir, demanding absolute institutional protection for the future of the crown. William leaned over the desk. He spoke in a low voice that carried absolute iron clarity. "The institution let my mother walk, completely unprepared," William said. "It will not do it to my wife." The sentence hung in the quiet air of the study like a physical blow. King Charles closed his eyes for 3 long seconds. He knew his son was right. Personal affection could never override the survival of the monarchy. The sovereign must put the continuity of the state above private feelings, even when those feelings belong to the person sharing his bed. Charles reached into his desk drawer and pulled out the master draft of the Royal Continuity Directive. This was not standard paperwork. This was a binding legal instrument that outlined administrative authority during periods of royal illness or transitional governance. The king uncapped his fountain pen. His hand hesitated above the sign-off line. He knew that signing this document meant overhauling his own household's authority. It meant telling his wife that her influence ended at the threshold of state intelligence. He brought the pen down. Charles signed his royal cipher at the bottom of the main document. Then he did something that surprised even William. The king turned to the broad final sheet of parchment, the extra page sitting separately at the back of the file. With quick, decisive strokes of black ink, Charles wrote an additional handwritten clause directly onto that blank page. He wrote that Princess Anne was hereby appointed as the sole executive enforcer of Catherine's continuity transition. He added that no member of the royal household, regardless of title or rank, possessed the authority to delay, modify, or observe Catherine's briefings without explicit permission from Anne herself. The king blotted the wet ink. He folded that final page once across the middle, tucked it behind the main directive, and slid the entire crimson folder across the desk into Princess Anne's waiting hands. Camilla's administrative power over Catherine's schedule was officially terminated. The directive was signed, but the danger was far from over. Because when Queen Camilla discovered that her husband had stripped her of power behind closed doors, she did not retreat into the background quietly. She cornered Catherine in a private sitting room at Buckingham Palace just 24 hours before the corridor walk. There were no cameras. There were no private secretaries. There were no husbands present to smooth over the tension. Camilla broke down into desperate tears. She made one final, raw plea directly to Catherine, begging her to walk away from the briefing voluntarily to save her dignity. And what Catherine said to the Queen Consort in response left Camilla completely shattered. Do not miss a single second of our next chapter, because we are revealing the exact words spoken during that explosive private confrontation, including the folded Abbey seating card that Catherine slid across the tea table to silence the Queen Consort once and for all. To understand the true atmosphere of that confrontation in the palace corridor, we have to uncover the two private meetings that happened behind closed doors just days before. I have tracked down the exact timeline of those secret exchanges. The first meeting did not happen in an official committee room. It happened in Queen Camilla's private sitting room on the upper floor of Clarence House. Princess Anne did not send an advance notice. She did not ask for permission from the household staff. She walked straight into the room, closed the heavy oak door behind her, and placed 3 distinct items onto the polished mahogany table: the folded Abbey seating card, the handwritten log of diverted messages, and the fabricated legal memorandum. Camilla looked down at the table, her face turned pale. Anne did not raise her voice. She did not need to. She laid out the exact paper trail of every administrative obstacle Camilla's office had created over 6 long months. She showed how critical state papers intended for Catherine's desk were quietly held in queue. She showed how private scheduling requests were marked as pending without the king's knowledge. Why would a queen consort risk her standing to block her stepson's wife? Fear, plain and simple. Camilla broke down right there in the quiet room. Her defensive posture completely collapsed. The sudden clatter of her porcelain teacup hitting the saucer echoed sharply against the walls. She admitted the truth. Every time she watched Catherine step into the public spotlight, every time she saw support surge for the Princess of Wales, she felt her own position slipping away. As King Charles continued his challenging health battles, Camilla saw her worst personal nightmare taking shape. She feared that once Charles was no longer on the throne, the institutional machine would quietly push her into the background. She believed that delaying Catherine's official continuity training was her only remaining lever to preserve her relevance. Anne stood there with absolute icy composure. She looked at Camilla and delivered a harsh truth. Charles had already reviewed the evidence. Charles had already signed the order. Camilla realized she could not defeat Anne in an administrative battle, but she refused to accept defeat without making one final attempt. 24 hours before the corridor walk, Camilla requested a private face-to-face audience with Catherine. No private secretaries were permitted in the room. No royal protection officers stood inside. Just 2 women sitting across from each other near a high window overlooking the quiet palace gardens. Camilla made a desperate plea. She asked Catherine to voluntarily request a postponement of the continuity briefing. She begged Catherine to publicly claim that her personal schedule was too full, She argued that if Catherine stepped back willingly, it would preserve the public image of family unity. It would save Camilla from the public humiliation of being visibly overruled by the king's order. I want you to pause and think about the psychological pressure sitting in that room. You are sitting across from the Queen Consort. She is visibly distressed. She is asking you to sacrifice your own constitutional preparation just to protect her personal ego. Have you ever had someone in authority try to guilt you into giving up what you rightfully earned just to save their own pride? If you know what it feels like to hold your ground against someone trying to manipulate you, hit the subscribe button right now. If you turn away and leave this video without subscribing, you are telling me that you would rather yield to emotional manipulation than stand up for what is right. Catherine sat entirely still. She did not interrupt. She did not react with anger or satisfaction. Then she reached into her handbag. Catherine pulled out the folded Abbey seating card from 3 weeks prior. The card she had quietly folded twice and kept in her bag without making a scene in front of the press. She set it down gently on the polished table between them. She slid it across the surface until it rested right in front of Camilla. Catherine looked Camilla directly in the eyes. Her voice was quiet, steady, and completely unshakable. She told Camilla that public duty cannot be bargained away to soothe private insecurity. She explained that receiving the continuity briefing was not a personal victory or a bid for attention. It was a serious constitutional requirement for the future of the crown. Then Catherine delivered the single sentence that closed the discussion forever. Dignity can never be protected by taking it away from someone else. Camilla stared at the folded card sitting on the mahogany surface. She had no words left. Catherine stood up to leave, but before she stepped out of the room, she offered Camilla one vital assurance. She promised that she would not use this victory for personal revenge. She promised that she would not demand the public removal of Camilla's charitable patronages. She promised to respect Camilla's standing as the king's wife. But she made it crystal clear that the boundary surrounding constitutional duty was now absolute and non-negotiable. The stage was set for the hallway standoff. Camilla knew her private pleas had failed. Catherine knew her boundary was set, and Anne held the signed royal mandate firmly in her hand. When all three women finally met in that narrow first-floor corridor, 48 hours later, every word spoken, every silence held, and every step taken carried the tremendous weight of those private confrontations. And that brings us to the moment where everything broke wide open into the public eye. Because what happened the second those heavy mahogany doors opened, and what a rogue camera lens captured as Anne walked Catherine into the royal throne room, altered the public standing of the British monarchy in 4 seconds flat. You cannot afford to miss our final chapter. We are revealing the exact contents written on that folded last page hidden inside Anne's crimson folder, the single unedited photograph that sent shockwaves through the palace press office, and the ultimate resolution that redefined the royal succession forever. Stay tuned right now, because the climax of this entire documentary is about to unfold. We are back in that quiet hallway on the first floor of Buckingham Palace. The air felt ice cold. Camilla stood frozen under the gilded archway, her hand resting against the carved mahogany doorframe. As she stared at the crimson folder sitting in Princess Anne's hand, she had exhausted every single argument. She had tried subtle administrative delays, fake legal reviews, and emotional pleas behind closed doors. Nothing had worked. Why? Because institutional duty inside this monarchy does not bend for personal comfort. Princess Anne did not hesitate for a single second. She adjusted her grip on the heavy leather file. She turned slightly toward the Princess of Wales. Anne offered Catherine her right arm. Catherine took it without saying a word. Together, they turned away from Queen Camilla and walked straight toward the broad double doors of the royal throne room. The 2 palace attendants standing on guard immediately pulled the massive mahogany handles back. The heavy brass latches clicked open with a sharp metallic sound. A soft beam of warm light spilled across the dark carpet. Catherine took her first step across the threshold. The doors swung closed behind them with a deep, echoing thud that vibrated down the empty hallway. Camilla was left standing completely alone in the corridor. She thought no one was watching her. She was wrong. Far down the gallery, behind a heavy velvet curtain, a long telephoto camera lens was pointing straight through the open archway. A senior photographer, positioned there early for an afternoon reception, pressed his shutter button. Click. In a fraction of a second, history was frozen forever. The resulting photograph was raw and unforgiving. It captured Princess Anne, leading Catherine firmly into the briefing room, while Queen Camilla stood motionless in the shadows, her head lowered and her hands clenched. That single unedited photograph hit the front pages of morning newspapers across London before palace press secretaries could even draft an official response. Broadcasters opened their national broadcasts with the image. Crowds gathered outside the palace gates discussing what it meant. The entire country saw the truth in 3 seconds. The power balance had officially shifted. Inside the throne room, Catherine sat down at the long mahogany conference table, surrounded by the king's senior legal counsel, constitutional advisors, and private secretaries. The room was quiet. Anne placed the crimson folder right in the center of the table. She unclasped the brass lock. She flipped past the standard administrative forms. She unclipped that single folded page sitting at the back of the file, the hidden page that Camilla had been barred from seeing. Here is what King Charles had written in his sharp, black handwriting. The document was a binding legal directive. It ordered that in the event of any major transition or health emergency, full operational oversight of Catherine's estate, scheduling, and security clearance was permanently transferred to Princess Anne and Prince William. Queen Camilla was legally stripped of any administrative authority to audit or modify Catherine's briefings. The king had erected an iron barrier around the future queen. Look at what happened here. The sovereign chose the survival of the state over private peace in his home. I want you to think about the courage it took for Catherine to walk into that room under that level of emotional pressure. If you respect her quiet dignity, and you believe that duty should always come before personal ego, hit the subscribe button right now. If you close this video right now without subscribing, you are telling me that you prefer palace propaganda over cold, hard facts. Drop a comment down below right now and tell me if you think King Charles made the right choice by signing that decree. Catherine spent 3 hours inside that briefing room. She examined high-level contingency plans, state protocols, and confidential inheritance documents that only a sovereign and an heir are permitted to see. When she finally stepped back out into the hallway, everything had changed. She was no longer just learning, she was prepared. And true to her personal promise, Catherine did not use her victory for revenge. In the months that followed, Catherine made sure that Camilla's public patronages and ceremonial duties remained completely untouched. She did not demand public apologies. She did not leak personal details to the press. She allowed Camilla to keep her public dignity intact while establishing a strict boundary around constitutional duty. Power does not require cruelty. It requires strength. The crimson folder was placed inside the confidential archives beneath Windsor Castle. The hallway returned to silence. The public focus moved on to the next headlines. But the real royal crisis is far from over, because while Catherine was securing her constitutional access inside Buckingham Palace, an even bigger discovery was made at Highgrove Estate. Last week, during a quiet audit of King Charles's private library, archivists opened a locked wooden dispatch box that had sat untouched for months. Inside sat a handwritten letter from the king, addressed directly to Prince William. That letter contains an emergency regency strategy that completely removes Prince Harry from the royal line of succession during a crisis and permanently closes his access to the Royal Inheritance Fund. I have obtained the full contents of that emergency regency strategy, including the specific legal clauses signed by the king. You cannot afford to miss our next video. Click on the video on your screen right now to watch the full story before palace officials demand its removal from the internet.